The mahogany doors of the Whitmore Estate's main library burst open with a force that made the crystal chandelier tremble. There stood my stepmother, Victoria Caldwell, her perfectly manicured fingers clutching a stack of legal documents, her face twisted with a mixture of triumph and greed. She had no idea that in exactly 37 minutes her entire world would crumble when I walked through those same doors, wearing the 4 stars of United States Army General. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My father, Colonel James Whitmore, was a man who commanded respect without ever having to demand it. Standing 6 feet tall with silver hair that seemed to catch light even in the darkest rooms, he had the kind of presence that made people straighten their shoulders when he entered a space. He'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan, earned a Purple Heart, and built a manufacturing empire that supplied specialized equipment to military contractors worldwide. The Whitmore name meant something in both military and business circles. I was 22 when my mother, Eleanor, lost her battle with cancer. Dad was stationed overseas at the time, and I remember standing in the rain at Arlington National Cemetery, watching them fold the flag that had draped her casket. The weight of that moment, the finality of it, changed something fundamental in both of us. Dad retired from active duty 6 months later, throwing himself into expanding his business with the same tactical precision he'd once applied to military operations. The estate in Potomac, Maryland, became his fortress. Sprawling across 43 acres of perfectly manicured grounds, the main house alone contained 14 bedrooms, a library with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Potomac River, and a study lined with military memorabilia from 3 generations of Whitmore service members. The property also housed a guest cottage, stables, and a workshop where Dad would disappear for hours, tinkering with prototype designs for his company. For 5 years, it was just the 2 of us. Dad would wake before dawn, review business reports over coffee in the sunroom, then spend his days either at the company headquarters in Bethesda or locked in meetings with Pentagon officials. Evenings were quieter affairs, dinner in the formal dining room, discussions about my studies at West Point, and occasionally, late-night conversations about Mom's memory in the library where her portrait still hung above the fireplace. Dad never spoke about dating or remarriage. He wore his wedding ring until the day he died, and I assumed he'd made peace with spending his remaining years as a widower. The business was thriving, expanding into new contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Forbes had recently estimated his net worth at around $120 million, though Dad always brushed off such speculation with a dismissive wave of his hand. Everything changed on a Tuesday in March when he walked into the house with a woman I'd never seen before. Victoria Caldwell was 38 years old, which made her exactly half my father's age. She had the kind of polished beauty that came from expensive salons and personal trainers, auburn hair that always fell in perfect waves, green eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they looked at, and a smile that never quite reached those eyes. She wore designer clothes with the casualness of someone who'd never had to check price tags, and she had a way of touching Dad's arm during conversations that seemed both intimate and possessive. "Rebecca, I'd like you to meet Victoria," Dad said that first evening, his voice carrying an unfamiliar lightness. "We met at the charity gala for wounded veterans last month." Victoria extended a hand with perfectly manicured nails, her grip firm but brief. "Your father has told me so much about you, dear. A West Point cadet. How impressive. You must be incredibly disciplined." The way she said disciplined made it sound like a character flaw rather than a virtue. I shook her hand and managed a polite smile, but something in her demeanor immediately set my teeth on edge. There was a calculating quality to her warmth, as if she were constantly measuring reactions and adjusting her approach accordingly. Over the following weeks, Victoria became a regular presence at the estate. She'd arrive for dinner with flowers for the table and wine that cost more than most people's monthly groceries. She listened to Dad's war stories with rapt attention, asked intelligent questions about his business, and gradually began leaving personal items around the house. A silk scarf draped over a chair in the library, expensive perfume in the guest bathroom, a pair of reading glasses on the kitchen counter. I was completing my final year at West Point, so I only saw these changes during weekend visits and brief holidays. Each time I returned, Victoria had claimed a little more territory. The guest bedroom where she'd initially stayed during overnight visits was slowly being transformed with her personal touches. Different curtains, a new bedspread, family photos on the nightstand that didn't include any Whitmores. Dad seemed genuinely happy for the first time since Mom's death. He laughed more, took Victoria on weekend trips to their cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and began talking about having someone to share his retirement years with. When he announced their engagement 6 months after that first meeting, I felt my stomach drop, but I forced myself to be supportive. "She makes me feel young again, Rebecca," he told me during one of our walks around the property. "I know it might seem sudden, but at my age you don't have the luxury of wasting time." The wedding was held at the estate on a crisp October morning, with about 60 guests scattered across the back lawn. Victoria wore a dress that probably cost more than a new car, and Dad looked happier than I'd seen him in years. I stood as his best woman, despite my reservations, because I wanted him to be happy. The ceremony was tasteful but expensive. Ice sculptures, a string quartet, and catering from the most exclusive restaurant in Georgetown. Victoria moved into the master bedroom immediately after the honeymoon. She redecorated it completely, removing the photographs of my mother and replacing them with abstract art that looked like it belonged in a hotel rather than a home. She hired an interior designer to refresh the main living areas, transforming the warm, comfortable spaces where I'd grown up into something that looked like a spread in Architectural Digest. The changes weren't limited to decor. Victoria began inserting herself into Dad's business decisions, attending meetings where she had no expertise, and offering opinions on military contracts that she clearly didn't understand. She convinced him to hire her brother, Marcus, as a consultant for the company, despite the fact that his previous experience consisted primarily of managing a failed restaurant chain. Most troubling was how she began isolating Dad from his longtime friends and business associates. Military buddies who'd been regular dinner guests found themselves uninvited to gatherings. Business partners who'd worked with Dad for decades suddenly found their phone calls screened by Victoria, who claimed to be protecting James from unnecessary stress. I tried to raise my concerns during one of my visits, but Dad brushed them off with an easy smile. "Victoria just wants what's best for the family, Rebecca. She's protective, that's all. You'll understand when you're older." The phrase, "the family," stung. There had been a time when the family meant Dad and me, with Mom's memory binding us together. Now it seemed to mean Dad and Victoria, with everyone else relegated to the periphery. During my final semester at West Point, I received a commission as a second lieutenant in the Army Corps of Engineers. Dad attended the graduation ceremony, beaming with pride as I received my gold bars. Victoria was there too, but she spent most of the time on her phone, apparently handling what she called urgent business matters for the company. After graduation, I was stationed at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. The distance made it easier to avoid witnessing the continued transformation of my childhood home, but it also meant I was less aware of how dramatically things were changing. Dad and I maintained regular phone contact, but our conversations became shorter and more superficial. Victoria was often in the background during these calls, and I could sense her presence influencing the topics we discussed. 2 years passed quickly. I was promoted to first lieutenant and then to captain, earning recognition for my work on infrastructure projects in challenging environments. The military had always been my calling, and I threw myself into my duties with the same dedication that had driven 3 generations of Whitmore women and men. It was during my 3rd year at Fort Bragg that I began noticing troubling changes in Dad's health. He'd always been robust and energetic, but during my infrequent visits home, he seemed tired and older than his 76 years. His hands shook slightly when he held his coffee cup, and he'd begun forgetting details about conversations we'd had just days before. Victoria was quick to explain these changes as normal aging, but she also began taking on more responsibilities for managing Dad's affairs. She obtained power of attorney for his business decisions, citing his need to, quote, focus on his health rather than paperwork. She convinced him to consolidate his various bank accounts and investment portfolios, ostensibly to simplify his financial management. The business, meanwhile, was struggling. Several longtime employees had quit or been dismissed, replaced by Victoria's friends and relatives who lacked the technical expertise necessary for military contracting. Key contracts were being mismanaged, and the company's reputation for reliability was beginning to suffer. I tried to discuss these concerns with Dad during one of my visits, but he seemed genuinely confused by my questions. "Victoria handles all of that now," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "I trust her completely. She's family." That word, family, had become Victoria's weapon of choice. She used it to justify every decision, every change, every gradual erosion of the life Dad had built. And increasingly, she used it to exclude me from conversations about his care, his business, and his future. The final time I saw my father alive was during a brief visit in September. He was sitting in the sunroom, staring out at the Potomac with a blank expression that I'd never seen before. When I approached, he looked up with momentary confusion before recognition dawned in his eyes. "Rebecca," he said, his voice softer than I remembered. "How's the Army treating you?" We spent an hour together, discussing my recent promotion and my hopes for the future. For brief moments, he seemed like the sharp, engaged man I'd always known. But then Victoria appeared, explaining that he needed to rest and that too much excitement wasn't good for his condition. As I was leaving, Dad grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "Take care of yourself, soldier," he said, using the nickname he'd called me since childhood. "Make sure you're ready for whatever comes next." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. At the time, I thought he was just offering fatherly advice. I had no idea he was preparing me for a battle that would determine not just the fate of his fortune, but the very definition of what family meant. 3 weeks later, I received the call that would change everything. Dad had died peacefully in his sleep, Victoria reported, with no signs of distress or struggle. The funeral was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and she'd already made all the arrangements. The phone call came at 0347 hours on a Thursday morning. I was in my quarters at Fort Bragg, deep in sleep after a grueling 18-hour training exercise, when the shrill ring cut through the darkness. Military training had conditioned me to wake instantly, but nothing could have prepared me for Victoria's voice on the other end of the line. "Rebecca, I'm so sorry to have to tell you this way," she said, her tone carrying just the right amount of tremor to sound genuine. "Your father passed away peacefully in his sleep last night. The paramedics said it was his heart. Very quick, no suffering." I sat up in bed, my mind struggling to process the words. Dad had seemed frail during my last visit, but heart failure? He'd never mentioned any cardiac issues, and his last physical examination had been clean according to the medical records I had seen. "What exactly happened?" I asked, my voice hoarse with sleep and shock. "He went to bed around 10:30, same as always. I found him this morning when I brought him his coffee. The doctor said these things happen suddenly in men his age, especially with his history of stress from the military and business pressures." Something in her explanation felt rehearsed, but grief has a way of making everything seem surreal. I requested emergency leave and drove through the night to reach the estate, my mind racing with memories of Dad and questions about what came next. The house felt different when I arrived the next morning. Victoria had already transformed the main living room into a receiving area for condolences, with formal flower arrangements and a guest book positioned near the entrance. She greeted me at the door wearing an elegant black dress that looked expensive even by her standards, her makeup perfect despite the early hour. "Oh, Rebecca," she said, embracing me with what felt like practiced sympathy. "I'm so glad you're here. There's so much to handle, and I could use your help with the arrangements." The funeral preparations were already well underway. Victoria had contacted Dad's attorney, scheduled the service for the following Tuesday, and begun notifying his business associates and military contacts. She seemed remarkably composed for someone who'd just lost her husband, moving through the logistics with the efficiency of someone executing a well-planned operation. "I hope you don't mind that I took the initiative," she said, as we sat in the kitchen later that morning. "I know how these things can become overwhelming, and I wanted to spare you the burden of making decisions while you're grieving." I appreciated her thoughtfulness, but something felt off about the entire situation. Dad had always been meticulous about planning, and I found it hard to believe he hadn't left specific instructions about his funeral arrangements. When I asked about his preferences, Victoria's answer was vague. "We discussed it briefly last year," she said, pouring herself coffee from an expensive machine I'd never seen before. "He wanted something simple and dignified, nothing too elaborate. I think he'd approve of what I've arranged." The service was held at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church in Bethesda, the same church where my parents had been married 35 years earlier. Victoria had invited approximately 200 people, including business associates, military colleagues, and social acquaintances from their country club. The turnout was impressive, testament to the respect Dad had earned throughout his career. I delivered the eulogy, speaking about Dad's dedication to service, his love for his family, and his transformation from military officer to successful businessman. Victoria sat in the front pew, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, accepting condolences from guests who praised her devotion to Dad during his final years. The reception was held at the estate, with catering provided by the same company that had handled their wedding 3 years earlier. Victoria moved through the crowd with grace, accepting sympathy, while simultaneously managing the logistics of feeding and entertaining 200 guests. She seemed to know everyone, introducing herself to military officers I'd never met and discussing business matters with Dad's longtime partners. It was during the reception that I first noticed Marcus Caldwell, Victoria's brother, having intense conversations with several of Dad's key employees. Marcus was a thin man in his early 40s, with receding hair and the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was always working an angle. He'd been hanging around the business for the past 2 years, supposedly providing, quote, strategic consulting, but his actual contributions had always been unclear. "Marcus has been such a help during this difficult time," Victoria explained when I asked about his presence at what seemed like business meetings. "He's handling some of the immediate operational concerns so I can focus on the funeral arrangements." After the guests departed, Victoria and I sat in the library, surrounded by the condolence cards and flower arrangements that had accumulated throughout the day. The room felt hollow without Dad's presence, and I found myself staring at the empty leather chair where he'd spent countless evenings reading military history and business reports. "I know this is difficult timing," Victoria said, her voice taking on a more businesslike tone, "but we need to discuss some practical matters. The attorney wants to meet with us tomorrow morning to review your father's will and discuss the estate." I nodded, assuming this would be a straightforward process. Dad had always been organized about his affairs, and I expected his will to reflect his methodical approach to everything else in his life. Victoria seemed confident about the arrangements, which I took as a positive sign. "There's something else we need to discuss," she continued, reaching for a manila folder that had been sitting on the side table. "Your father's business interests require immediate attention. Some of the military contracts have time-sensitive provisions, and we can't afford any disruptions during the transition period." She opened the folder to reveal a stack of legal documents, each marked with colored tabs and sticky notes. The complexity of the paperwork was immediately apparent: corporate agreements, government contracts, banking arrangements, and investment portfolios that represented the full scope of Dad's business empire. "I've been working closely with the company's legal team," Victoria explained, "and they've advised me that continuity of leadership is crucial. The Pentagon doesn't like uncertainty when it comes to their contractors, and any appearance of instability could jeopardize our existing agreements." Her use of the word "our" struck me as presumptuous, but I assumed she was referring to her role as Dad's widow and presumed beneficiary of his estate. The business had been his life's work, and it made sense that whoever inherited it would need to take immediate action to preserve its value. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked, skimming through the documents she'd laid out. "The lawyers have prepared some temporary arrangements that will allow me to maintain operational control until the estate is settled," she said, pointing to specific clauses in the contracts. "It's really just a formality, but it ensures that nothing falls through the cracks while we're dealing with the inheritance process." The documents looked professionally prepared, with the letterhead of Hartwell, Burke & Associates, the law firm that had handled Dad's business affairs for over a decade. I recognized some of the language from similar contracts I'd reviewed during my military service, though the specific provisions were complex enough to require careful study. "I'll need time to review these thoroughly," I said, setting the papers aside. "This is a lot to process on top of everything else." Victoria's expression tightened slightly, but she quickly recovered her composure. "Of course, dear. I understand completely. But I do hope we can finalize everything quickly. The business world doesn't pause for grief, unfortunately." The next morning, we met with Harold Hartwell, Dad's longtime attorney, at his office in downtown Washington. Hartwell was a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair, and the kind of precise manner that comes from decades of handling high-stakes legal matters. He'd known Dad since their college days at Virginia Military Institute, and their relationship had always been built on mutual respect and trust. "Please accept my condolences on your father's passing," Hartwell said as we settled into his conference room. "James was not only a valued client, but a personal friend. His loss is felt deeply by everyone who knew him." He opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a bound document marked "Last Will and Testament of James Robert Whitmore." The formality of the moment struck me. This piece of paper would determine the fate of everything Dad had built over his lifetime. "Before we proceed with the reading," Hartwell said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "I need to address some irregularities that have come to my attention. 3 weeks ago, James contacted me about making significant changes to his estate plan. He seemed confused about some of the provisions and asked me to explain documents that I had never prepared." Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but her expression remained neutral. "James was having some memory issues in his final weeks," she said. "The doctor attributed it to stress and his medication regimen. I tried to help him with his paperwork, but he sometimes became confused about what he'd signed and when." Hartwell's eyes narrowed slightly. "The concerning part is that James mentioned documents that purported to transfer power of attorney and certain business interests to you, Victoria. However, these documents were not prepared by my firm, and they contain provisions that contradict the estate plan we had established." "I don't understand," I said, feeling a chill run down my spine. "What kind of provisions?" "Documents that would effectively transfer control of the business and certain property rights immediately upon James's death, bypassing the normal probate process. These arrangements were supposedly designed to avoid tax complications, but they're structured in ways that seem designed to circumvent the intentions expressed in his original will." Victoria's composure began to crack. "I was only trying to help James manage his affairs during a difficult time. He was worried about the business, about Rebecca's future, about making sure everything was handled properly. We consulted with several financial advisors who recommended these arrangements." "Which advisors?" Hartwell asked pointedly. "Because I've been James's attorney for 23 years, and he never mentioned consulting with anyone else about his estate planning." The room fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on Hartwell's desk. I found myself studying Victoria's face, looking for tells that might reveal her true intentions. Her green eyes had lost their usual calculating gleam, replaced by something that looked like panic. "Perhaps we should proceed with reading the original will," Hartwell continued, "and then we can address these other documents separately. I want to ensure that James's true intentions are honored, regardless of any confusion that may have occurred in his final weeks." He opened the will and began reading in the formal language required by law. The document was dated 18 months earlier, long before Dad's health had begun to deteriorate. As Hartwell's voice filled the room, the scope of Dad's wealth became clear. The manufacturing company, the estate, investment portfolios, bank accounts, and various other assets totaling approximately $120 million. "To my daughter, Rebecca Marie Whitmore," Hartwell read, "I leave the entirety of my estate, including all business interests, real property, and financial assets, with the exception of the specific bequests outlined below." I felt my heart skip a beat. Dad had left me everything. "To my wife, Victoria Caldwell Whitmore," the reading continued, "I leave the sum of $500,000 and the right to remain in the guest cottage on the estate property for a period of 1 year following my death, provided she does not contest this will or interfere with the administration of the estate." Victoria's face went white. The comfortable inheritance she'd apparently been expecting had just evaporated, replaced by what amounted to a modest severance package. "There's more," Hartwell said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. James included a specific provision about the circumstances under which these bequests might be modified. He continued reading, "If any person attempts to circumvent the provisions of this will through fraudulent documents, coercion, or other illegal means, they shall forfeit any claim to my estate, and shall be subject to prosecution under applicable laws." The implications were clear. Dad had anticipated exactly what was happening. Victoria stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is impossible. James and I discussed his estate planning extensively. He assured me that I would be provided for, that the business would continue under stable management. There must be some mistake." "I'm afraid there's no mistake," Hartwell replied calmly. "This will was prepared with James's full knowledge and consent. He was very specific about his intentions." "But the power of attorney documents," Victoria insisted, "the business arrangements we made, surely those take precedence over an old will." Hartwell's expression hardened. Those documents, if they exist, would need to be authenticated and reviewed for legitimacy. "Given the circumstances James described during our last conversation, I have serious doubts about their validity." Victoria gathered her purse with shaking hands. "I need to consult with my own attorney about this. There are clearly some misunderstandings that need to be resolved." As she headed for the door, Hartwell called after her, "Victoria, I should mention that James also provided me with specific instructions about what to do if his will was contested. He was very thorough in his preparations." She paused at the door, her hand on the handle. "What kind of instructions?" "Let's just say that he anticipated various scenarios and made provisions accordingly. I suggest you consider your next steps very carefully." After Victoria left, Hartwell and I spent another hour reviewing the details of Dad's estate. The business alone was worth approximately $80 million, with the real estate, investments, and other assets accounting for the remainder. It was a staggering inheritance, but more importantly, it represented Dad's life's work and his faith in my ability to continue his legacy. "Your father knew this day would come," Hartwell explained as we concluded our meeting. "He suspected that Victoria's interest in him might not be entirely romantic, and he took steps to protect both his estate and your inheritance." "What kind of steps?" I asked. "He hired a private investigator to look into Victoria's background and her activities during their marriage. The report makes for interesting reading. He also installed security cameras in certain areas of the house and maintained detailed records of his business interactions. He was building a case, Rebecca, in anticipation of exactly what just happened." I left Hartwell's office with a mixture of grief and determination. Dad had trusted me with his legacy, but Victoria clearly had no intention of accepting the will's provisions without a fight. The battle for the estate was just beginning, and I had no idea how far she was willing to go to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. The drive back to the estate gave me time to process what had just happened. Dad's final gift to me wasn't just his wealth. It was his recognition that I had the strength and integrity to protect what he'd built. But as I pulled into the circular driveway, I could see Victoria's Mercedes parked at an angle that suggested she'd arrived in a hurry. The real confrontation was about to begin. The estate was buzzing with activity when I arrived. Victoria's Mercedes wasn't the only unfamiliar vehicle in the driveway. 3 other cars were parked haphazardly near the main entrance, including a black BMW that screamed expensive legal representation. Through the tall windows of the library, I could see silhouettes moving about, animated gestures suggesting heated discussions were underway. I entered through the kitchen, hoping to assess the situation before announcing my presence. Maria Santos, the housekeeper who'd worked for our family for 15 years, intercepted me near the back staircase. Her usually calm demeanor was replaced by obvious anxiety. "Miss Rebecca, thank God you're here," she whispered in accented English. "Mrs. Victoria, she bring lawyers this morning. They been going through Mr. James's office, taking papers, photographing everything. She tell me I was not supposed to let you in the house." The audacity of Victoria's actions hit me like a physical blow. This was still legally Dad's property, and until the estate was settled, she had no authority to exclude me from my childhood home. More concerning was her systematic collection of documents. It suggested she was either building a case to contest the will or destroying evidence that might undermine her position. "Where exactly are they now?" I asked, keeping my voice low. In the library with Mrs. Victoria's brother and two men in suits. They have been there since 8 this morning, going through files, making phone calls. Mr. Marcus, he brought boxes like they were planning to take everything. I thanked Maria and made my way toward the library, my footsteps muffled by the Persian runner that stretched the length of the hallway. The voices became clearer as I approached, and I positioned myself just outside the doorway to listen. The private investigator's report is damaging, but not insurmountable, a male voice was saying. James hired him 18 months ago, which means he was already suspicious of Victoria's motives. However, the evidence is largely circumstantial. What about the security footage? This was Marcus, his voice tighter with stress than I'd ever heard it. If James was recording conversations, documenting everything. We've located most of the cameras, Victoria interrupted. The system was more extensive than I realized, but Marcus disabled the main server last week. Without the digital files, any footage would be inadmissible. I felt my blood pressure rising. They were discussing the destruction of evidence, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to defraud the estate. Dad had been more prepared than I'd realized, but Victoria had been systematically dismantling his safeguards. The bigger problem is the will itself, another voice interjected. Harold Hartwell is no fool, and he's been practicing estate law for 30 years. He knows exactly what he's doing, and he's clearly prepared for a challenge. Which is why we need to focus on the competency angle, Victoria said, her voice carrying the cold calculation I'd come to recognize. James was showing signs of dementia in his final months. If we can establish that he wasn't mentally capable of making sound decisions, we can argue that the will should be invalidated. Do we have medical evidence to support that claim? The first lawyer asked. Dr. Patterson has been James's physician for 12 years, Victoria replied. He's documented several incidents of confusion and memory loss. With the right presentation, we can make a compelling case that James was not of sound mind when he signed the will. I'd heard enough. The conspiracy was more extensive than I'd imagined, involving not just Victoria and her brother, but potentially Dad's own doctor and multiple attorneys. They were preparing to wage war against Dad's final wishes, using his declining health as a weapon to steal his legacy. I stepped into the library doorway, my military bearing making my presence immediately apparent. The conversation stopped abruptly as 4 heads turned toward me. Victoria's face cycled through surprise, anger, and something approaching fear before settling into a mask of false composure. Rebecca, she said, rising from Dad's desk chair with forced calm, I wasn't expecting you back so soon. Evidently, I replied, my voice carrying the authority I'd learned to project during my military service. I couldn't help but overhear your discussion about invalidating my father's will. Interesting strategy. The 2 lawyers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with having their legal strategy overheard by the primary beneficiary. Marcus stepped forward, attempting to take control of the situation. Rebecca, you have to understand, we're just trying to protect the family's interests, he said, his tone conciliatory but condescending. Your father's business empire requires experienced management, and Victoria has been intimately involved with the operations for the past 3 years. Intimately involved in running it into the ground, I countered. The company's performance has declined significantly since you both became involved. Key contracts have been mismanaged, experienced employees have been driven away, and the Pentagon is beginning to question the company's reliability. Victoria's mask slipped slightly. You've been away at your little military games for years, Rebecca. You have no idea what it takes to run a business of this magnitude. My little military games have included managing multi-million-dollar infrastructure projects, coordinating with defense contractors, and earning the respect of senior Pentagon officials, I said, stepping fully into the room. But more importantly, I understand integrity, something that seems to be in short supply in this room. The older of the 2 lawyers cleared his throat. Perhaps we should continue this discussion at another time. Emotions are running high and… No, I interrupted, my voice sharp with command authority. We're going to continue this discussion right now. I want to know exactly what you're planning to do with my father's estate, and I want to know what evidence you think you have to support your claims. Victoria stood up, her composure cracking further. This is still my home, Rebecca. I won't be interrogated in my own house by someone who couldn't be bothered to visit her dying father more than a handful of times. The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. My military duties had kept me away more than I'd liked, but Victoria had systematically discouraged my visits and limited my access to Dad during his final months. She'd weaponized my absence, using it to isolate him while positioning herself as his primary caregiver and confidant. "You're home?" I asked, letting the challenge hang in the air. "According to the will Harold Hartwell read this morning, you have the right to remain in the guest cottage for 1 year. This house belongs to me." Marcus stepped between us, his face flushed with anger. "You arrogant little." "Careful," I warned, my voice dropping to the low, dangerous tone I'd perfected during military training. "You're about to say something that will make this situation much more complicated than it needs to be." The second lawyer, who'd remained silent until now, finally spoke up. "I think we need to step back and approach this more professionally. Mrs. Whitmore, perhaps we should schedule a formal meeting with Ms. Whitmore's legal representation." "I don't think so," Victoria said, her voice rising. "Rebecca wants to play hardball? Fine. We'll contest the will on the grounds of diminished capacity. We'll subpoena every medical record, every business decision James made in his final year. We'll demonstrate that he was being manipulated by a daughter who saw dollar signs instead of a father who needed care." The irony of the accusation was breathtaking. Victoria, who had systematically isolated Dad from his friends and family, who had inserted herself into his business affairs and positioned herself to inherit his fortune, was accusing me of manipulation and greed. "You're welcome to try," I said, my military training helping me maintain calm despite the fury building inside. "But I should warn you that Dad was more prepared for this scenario than you realize." "What's that supposed to mean?" Marcus demanded. "It means that while you were busy playing house and positioning yourself for the inheritance, Dad was documenting everything. Every conversation, every business decision, every instance of you pressuring him to sign documents he didn't understand. He built a case, Victoria, and Harold Hartwell has every piece of evidence." Victoria's face went pale, but she rallied quickly. "You're bluffing. James trusted me completely. He shared everything with me." "Did he share his meeting with FBI investigators 3 weeks before he died?" I asked, watching her face carefully. "Did he mention the federal investigation into irregularities in several of his government contracts? Irregularities that coincidentally began appearing shortly after you and Marcus became involved with the business?" This was a calculated gamble. I had no knowledge of any FBI investigation, but Victoria's reaction would tell me everything I needed to know. Her face went ashen, and Marcus actually took a step backward. "That's impossible," the older lawyer said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" I asked, pressing my advantage. "Dad held security clearances for 30 years. He understood the importance of protecting classified information and maintaining the integrity of defense contracts. When he started noticing problems with the business, problems that could jeopardize national security, he did what any responsible citizen would do." Victoria sank back into Dad's chair, her hands trembling slightly. "You're lying. James never mentioned any investigation." "Of course he didn't," I replied. "He was protecting you, hoping you'd realize the gravity of what you were doing and stop before it was too late. But you didn't stop, did you? You kept pushing, kept manipulating, kept positioning yourself to take everything he'd built." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the antique clock and the sound of papers rustling as one of the lawyers began gathering documents. The dynamic had shifted dramatically, and everyone in the room could sense it. "I think we need to reassess our strategy," the younger lawyer said quietly to Victoria. "If there's a federal investigation, contesting the will becomes much more complicated." "There's no federal investigation," Victoria insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. "Rebecca is trying to intimidate us." "Maybe," the older lawyer replied, "but we can't afford to gamble with that possibility. Federal prosecutors don't have the same burden of proof as civil courts, and if they have evidence of fraud or contract manipulation." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood the implications. Federal charges would mean prison time, not just civil penalties. Marcus was the first to break. "Victoria, maybe we should consider accepting the will's provisions. $500,000 and a year in the cottage. That's not nothing. If we fight this and lose, we could end up with nothing. Or in federal prison, the younger lawyer added helpfully. Victoria's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled. "This isn't over," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "James promised me security, promised me a future. I devoted 3 years of my life to caring for him, managing his affairs, being the perfect wife. I earned that inheritance." "You earned $500,000 and a year of housing," I replied. "That's what Dad thought your 3 years of marriage were worth. I suggest you take it and disappear before Harold Hartwell decides to dig deeper into your activities." The lawyers were already packing their briefcases, clearly eager to distance themselves from what was rapidly becoming a legal nightmare. Marcus gathered the boxes they'd filled with documents, his hands shaking as he realized the gravity of their situation. "You think you've won," Victoria said, standing up with as much dignity as she could muster, "but you have no idea what you've inherited. The business is failing, the contracts are in jeopardy, and the Pentagon is losing confidence in the company's leadership. You'll spend your inheritance just trying to keep everything afloat." "That's my problem to solve," I replied. "Dad trusted me with his legacy, and I won't let him down." As Victoria and her entourage prepared to leave, she turned back one final time. "You know what the difference is between you and me, Rebecca? I loved your father. You just saw him as a duty, an obligation. You were too busy playing soldier to notice that he was lonely, that he needed someone to care about him." The words hit their mark because they contained just enough truth to sting. I had been focused on my military career, had missed signs of Dad's decline, had allowed Victoria to insert herself into his life. But love wasn't about manipulation or positioning yourself for financial gain. "If you loved him," I said quietly, "you would have honored his wishes instead of trying to steal his legacy." After they left, I stood alone in the library, surrounded by the evidence of their attempted theft. Books had been pulled from shelves, filing cabinets had been rifled through, and Dad's personal papers were scattered across his desk. The room that had always been his sanctuary had been violated by people who saw it only as a source of profit. I spent the rest of the afternoon restoring order to the library, carefully replacing books, and organizing the papers they'd left behind. As I worked, I found myself thinking about Victoria's final accusation. Had I failed Dad as a daughter? Had my military career cost me the relationship I should have prioritized? The truth was more complicated than Victoria's simplistic narrative. Yes, I'd been focused on my military service, but Dad had encouraged that focus. He'd been proud of my achievements, proud of the officer I'd become. He'd understood that serving my country was a calling, not just a career choice. But I also had to acknowledge that my absence had created the opening Victoria had exploited. If I'd been more present, more involved in Dad's day-to-day life, would I have recognized the signs of his decline? Would I have been able to protect him from her manipulation? As evening approached, I realized that the real battle was just beginning. Victoria might have retreated for now, but she was far from defeated. She had too much at stake to simply accept the will's provisions without a fight. The threat of federal investigation had bought me time, but it wouldn't eliminate her permanently. I needed to contact Harold Hartwell immediately to discuss the next steps. More importantly, I needed to understand exactly what Dad had discovered about Victoria's activities and what evidence he'd compiled. The private investigator's report was just the beginning. Dad had been building a comprehensive case against her, and I needed to understand every detail. The phone rang as I was locking up Dad's office, the sound echoing through the empty house. I answered it cautiously, unsure who would be calling at this hour. "Rebecca, this is Harold Hartwell. I hope I'm not calling too late, but I wanted to discuss some developments that have come to my attention." "What kind of developments?" I asked, feeling a familiar tension building in my stomach. "Victoria has retained Morrison, Kessler, and Associates to contest the will. They're one of the most aggressive probate firms in the region, and they specialize in challenging estate distributions. More concerning is that they've also hired a private investigator to look into your background and your relationship with your father." The escalation was exactly what I'd expected, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. Victoria was preparing for total war, and she was bringing professional weapons to the fight. "What do you recommend?" I asked. "We need to meet first thing tomorrow morning. There are things about your father's preparations that you need to understand, evidence that will be crucial if this goes to court. But more immediately, you need to be prepared for the possibility that Victoria will take more drastic action." "What kind of drastic action?" "The kind that desperate people take when they're facing the loss of everything they thought they'd secured." "Your father was very specific about the dangers you might face, Rebecca. He wanted you to be prepared for anything." As I hung up the phone, I realized that the confrontation in the library had been just the opening salvo. Victoria had invested 3 years of her life in positioning herself to inherit Dad's fortune, and she wasn't going to let it slip away without a fight that would test every skill I'd learned in my military career. The real battle was about to begin, and I had no idea how far Victoria was willing to go to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. The call came at 0630 hours the next morning, jerking me from the first decent sleep I'd managed since Dad's funeral. Harold Hartwell's voice was tense, carrying an urgency that immediately put me on high alert. "Rebecca, we have a serious problem. Victoria filed an emergency injunction last night, claiming you're mentally unstable and pose a danger to the estate's assets. She's requesting immediate guardianship of your father's business interests." I sat up in bed, my mind racing through the implications. On what grounds? Post-traumatic stress disorder from military service, alleged substance abuse, and claims that you threatened violence during yesterday's confrontation. She's also produced witness statements from her lawyers and her brother corroborating these allegations. The calculated nature of Victoria's attack was breathtaking. She'd transformed our heated exchange in the library into evidence of mental instability, using my military background against me by invoking stereotypes about combat veterans. It was a brilliant legal maneuver that could potentially freeze the estate assets while she maneuvered for a more permanent solution. "When's the hearing?" I asked, already mentally preparing for the legal battle ahead. "This afternoon at 2 o'clock. Judge Patricia Morrison is presiding, and she's known for taking mental health claims seriously. We need to meet immediately to prepare your defense." I arrived at Hartwell's office an hour later to find him surrounded by case files, legal briefs, and what appeared to be a comprehensive dossier on Victoria's background. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of a sleepless night, and his expression carried the weight of someone who understood the gravity of what we were facing. "The good news is that Victoria's legal team rushed this filing," he said, gesturing to the emergency injunction paperwork. "There are procedural errors and inconsistencies that we can exploit. The bad news is that if Judge Morrison grants even a temporary guardianship, Victoria will have access to your father's business accounts and the authority to make major decisions about the company." He opened a thick manila folder marked "Confidential" in Dad's familiar handwriting. "Before we discuss strategy, you need to understand what your father discovered about Victoria's true background and her activities during their marriage." The private investigator's report was damning. Victoria Caldwell wasn't even her real name. She'd been born Victoria Kowalski in Detroit, the daughter of a small-time con artist who'd taught her the fundamentals of long-term fraud. She'd been married twice before meeting Dad, both times to wealthy older men who'd died under suspicious circumstances. In each case, she'd inherited substantial sums after brief marriages, and in each case, the deceased husbands had shown signs of cognitive decline in their final months. "The pattern is unmistakable," Hartwell explained. "She targets successful older men, typically widowers, with substantial assets and adult children, who aren't closely involved in their daily lives. She gains their trust, isolates them from family and friends, then manipulates them into changing their estate plans." More disturbing were the medical records Dad's investigator had uncovered. Victoria had been purchasing prescription medications under various names, drugs that could cause confusion, memory loss, and cognitive impairment when administered in small doses over extended periods. The timeline of these purchases corresponded exactly with Dad's decline in mental acuity. "She was poisoning him," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "We believe so, yes. The investigator found evidence that she was crushing these medications into his evening tea. Small doses, nothing that would cause immediate alarm, but enough to create the appearance of natural cognitive decline. The implications were staggering. Victoria hadn't just been positioning herself to inherit Dad's fortune. She'd been systematically destroying his mental capacity to ensure he couldn't recognize or resist her manipulation. It was premeditated, calculated murder disguised as devoted caregiving. Why didn't Dad confront her directly, I asked. He was building a case for federal prosecutors. The medications she was purchasing were controlled substances obtained through fraudulent prescriptions. That's a federal crime. Combined with the business irregularities and the estate fraud, she was looking at decades in federal prison. Hartwell opened another folder containing surveillance photographs and financial records. Dad had been more thorough than I'd realized, documenting every suspicious transaction, every unusual behavior, every sign that Victoria was systematically looting his assets while destroying his ability to resist. The tragedy is that James died before he could complete his case. We have enough evidence to destroy Victoria in court, but presenting it effectively will require careful strategy. The hearing that afternoon was held in Judge Morrison's chambers, a wood-paneled room that felt more like a library than a courtroom. Victoria arrived with her legal team, her appearance carefully crafted to project concerned respectability. She wore a conservative navy suit and minimal makeup, her demeanor suggesting someone reluctantly forced to take action against a beloved but troubled stepdaughter. Her lead attorney, Richard Kessler, was a silver-haired man in his 60s, with the kind of polished confidence that came from decades of successful litigation. He presented Victoria's case with theatrical precision, painting me as a troubled veteran struggling with the psychological aftermath of military service. Your Honor, Ms. Whitmore's behavior has become increasingly erratic since her father's death, Kessler argued. Yesterday's confrontation included explicit threats of violence, paranoid accusations about federal investigations, and claims that my client was involved in some sort of conspiracy. These are classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder combined with grief-induced psychosis. He produced the witness statements from Victoria's lawyers and her brother, each describing my behavior in terms designed to support a mental health intervention. According to their testimony, I'd been aggressive, irrational, and potentially dangerous during our library confrontation. Mrs. Whitmore is not seeking personal gain, Kessler continued. She's requesting temporary guardianship solely to protect assets that represent not just her late husband's legacy, but the livelihoods of hundreds of employees who depend on stable business management. Victoria herself took the stand with convincing reluctance, her voice trembling as she described her concerns about my mental state. She spoke about my long absences during Dad's final years, my apparent inability to accept his death, and her fear that I might make impulsive decisions that would destroy everything he'd built. Rebecca was always distant, she testified, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. James worried constantly about her emotional state, about whether military service was affecting her ability to form healthy relationships. He confided in me that he sometimes didn't recognize the woman she'd become. It was a masterful performance, combining just enough truth with carefully crafted lies to create a compelling narrative. Victoria presented herself as the devoted wife, trying to protect both her stepdaughter and her late husband's legacy from the destructive impulses of a troubled veteran. When Hartwell rose to cross-examine Victoria, the atmosphere in the chamber shifted subtly. He approached the witness stand with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent decades exposing lies under oath. Mrs. Whitmore, you testified that you're concerned about protecting your late husband's business legacy. Can you explain why the company's performance has declined so dramatically since you became involved with its operations? Victoria's composure flickered slightly. I'm not sure what you mean. The business has faced challenges, but I'm referring to the loss of 3 major Pentagon contracts, the departure of 12 senior engineers, and a 40% decline in annual revenue since 2022. These are objective metrics, Mrs. Whitmore, not opinions. Kessler objected, claiming the questions were beyond the scope of the guardianship hearing, but Judge Morrison allowed the line of inquiry to continue. You also testified about your concern for your stepdaughter's mental health, Hartwell continued. During your marriage to James Whitmore, did you ever research medications that might cause cognitive impairment or memory loss? I don't understand the question, Victoria replied, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. Hartwell produced a stack of documents from his briefcase. These are pharmacy records showing multiple purchases of lorazepam, zolpidem, and haloperidol under various names between 2022 and 2024. Are you familiar with these medications? Victoria's face went pale. I occasionally had trouble sleeping. The stress of caring for an aging husband. These medications weren't prescribed for insomnia, Mrs. Whitmore. They're antipsychotics and sedatives that, when administered without medical supervision, can cause exactly the kind of cognitive decline your husband experienced in his final months. The courtroom fell silent except for the scratch of the court reporter's pen and the quiet hum of the air conditioning. Victoria stared at the documents in Hartwell's hands as if they were physical threats. I think we're getting far afield from the matter at hand, Kessler interjected, but his earlier confidence had evaporated. Judge Morrison leaned forward, her expression serious. I'd like to see those pharmacy records, Mr. Hartwell. As Hartwell approached the bench with the evidence, I felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, the same sensation I'd experienced before combat operations, when months of preparation crystallized into decisive action. This was the moment Dad had been preparing for, the confrontation he'd known would determine the fate of his legacy. But Victoria wasn't finished. As Hartwell returned to his table, she stood up abruptly, her mask of respectability finally slipping to reveal the desperation beneath. This is all fabricated evidence, she declared, her voice rising. James was paranoid in his final months, imagining conspiracies that didn't exist. Rebecca has obviously inherited his delusions along with his money. Mrs. Whitmore, please remain seated, Judge Morrison warned. No, I won't be silent while they destroy my reputation with lies and forged documents, Victoria continued, her composure completely shattered. James promised me security, promised me a future. I devoted 3 years of my life to caring for him, managing his affairs, being everything he needed. I earned that inheritance, and I won't let some absent daughter, who couldn't be bothered to visit her dying father, steal what's rightfully mine. The outburst was exactly what Hartwell had been hoping to provoke. Victoria's carefully crafted image of the concerned stepmother had dissolved, replaced by the calculating opportunist Dad's investigation had revealed. Your Honor, Hartwell said calmly, I believe Mrs. Whitmore's own words demonstrate exactly why James Whitmore structured his will as he did. Judge Morrison called for a 30-minute recess, during which Victoria huddled with her legal team in increasingly animated discussions. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see Kessler gesturing emphatically while Victoria appeared to be arguing with him. When court reconvened, the dynamic had shifted dramatically. Kessler's opening statement had been confident and theatrical, but his closing argument was subdued and defensive. Your Honor, while there may be questions about Mrs. Whitmore's background, the central issue remains Ms. Whitmore's capacity to manage a complex business empire during a period of obvious emotional distress. Hartwell's response was devastating in its simplicity. Your Honor, the evidence demonstrates that Victoria Whitmore systematically defrauded and possibly poisoned her husband while positioning herself to steal his estate. The idea that such a person should be granted guardianship over anything is not just inappropriate. It would be criminal negligence. Judge Morrison took less than 10 minutes to render her decision. The emergency injunction is denied. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the FBI for investigation of potential federal crimes including Medicare fraud, illegal pharmaceutical purchases, and possible homicide. Victoria's face went ashen as the implications sank in. What had begun as an aggressive legal maneuver to seize control of Dad's estate had backfired spectacularly, exposing her to federal prosecution and destroying any remaining credibility. As we left the courthouse, Hartwell pulled me aside for a final conversation. This isn't over, Rebecca. Victoria will likely disappear before federal investigators can locate her. But her brother Marcus is still involved with the business, and there may be other accomplices we haven't identified. What do you recommend? I asked. Take control of the company immediately. Review all contracts, audit all financial transactions, and remove anyone connected to Victoria's operations. The business is salvageable, but it will require someone with both the authority and the expertise to make difficult decisions quickly. That evening, I stood in Dad's study, surrounded by the evidence of Victoria's betrayal and the magnitude of the challenge ahead. The company Dad had built was wounded but not destroyed, and with careful management, it could be restored to its former strength. As I reviewed the financial reports and employee records, I began to understand the scope of Victoria's sabotage. She hadn't just stolen money, she'd systematically undermined the company's relationships with key clients, promoted unqualified personnel, and created operational inefficiencies that would take months to correct. The phone rang just after midnight, startling me from my analysis of the Pentagon contracts. I answered cautiously, expecting another crisis or legal complication. "Ms. Whitmore? This is General Patricia Hayes from the Pentagon's Defense Acquisition Board. I apologize for calling so late, but I wanted to discuss some urgent matters regarding your father's company." My heart stopped. General Hayes was a 4-star general with responsibility for overseeing major defense contracts. Her call could only mean that Victoria's sabotage had attracted attention at the highest levels of military leadership. "General Hayes, thank you for calling. I'm aware that there have been some irregularities with our contract performance, and I'm taking immediate steps to address them." "I'm glad to hear that, Ms. Whitmore. Your father's company has been a trusted partner for many years, and we'd like to see that relationship continue. However, I should mention that we've been monitoring some concerning developments over the past 18 months. She paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "I understand you've recently inherited control of the company. Before we discuss contract renewals, I need to understand your qualifications for managing defense-related operations." This was it, the moment where everything would be decided. Victoria's sabotage had damaged the company's reputation, and now the Pentagon was questioning whether I had the experience necessary to restore their confidence. "General Hayes, I'm Captain Rebecca Whitmore, currently serving with the Army Corps of Engineers. I've spent the past 8 years managing military infrastructure projects and working directly with defense contractors on complex operations." "Captain Whitmore?" she repeated, and I could hear surprise in her voice. "Are you the same Captain Whitmore who led the Afghanistan infrastructure reconstruction project?" "Yes, ma'am, that was my operation." The line fell silent for several seconds. When General Hayes spoke again, her tone had changed completely. "Captain, I think we need to have a much more detailed conversation about your plans for the company. Your work in Afghanistan was exceptional, and if you're taking personal control of your father's operations, that changes everything." As I hung up the phone, I realized that Victoria's greatest miscalculation hadn't been underestimating Dad's preparations or overestimating her own cunning. Her fatal error had been assuming that military service had made me weak rather than strong, that my years away from the business world had left me unprepared for the challenges ahead. Tomorrow I would walk back into that library where Victoria had celebrated her anticipated victory. But this time I wouldn't be walking in as the grieving daughter she'd tried to manipulate and discredit. I would be walking in as the woman Dad had always known I would become, a leader capable of protecting his legacy and building something even greater from the foundation he'd provided. The real battle was about to begin, but Victoria had already lost. She just didn't know it yet. The mahogany doors of the estate's main library stood exactly as they had 3 days earlier, but everything else had changed. I could hear voices inside, Victoria's desperate pleading mixing with Marcus's agitated responses, and what sounded like frantic phone calls to various attorneys. They were trapped, and they knew it. I straightened my dress blue uniform, checking that every ribbon, every insignia, every detail was perfect. The weight of the 4 stars on my shoulders felt substantial, not just physically, but symbolically. These weren't borrowed credentials or inherited authority. I had earned every single star through years of exemplary service, strategic brilliance, and unwavering dedication to duty. The promotion had come through just hours earlier, delivered personally by General Hayes during an emergency meeting at the Pentagon. My work in Afghanistan hadn't just been successful, it had been transformational, saving the military millions of dollars while establishing new protocols for international infrastructure development. The promotion from captain to brigadier general was unprecedented in its speed, but my record spoke for itself. More importantly, my new rank came with something Victoria could never have anticipated: direct oversight authority for all Pentagon contractors, including Dad's company. I pushed open the library doors with deliberate force, my polished boots clicking against the hardwood floor with military precision. The conversation stopped immediately as three heads turned toward me in unison. Victoria's face cycled through confusion, recognition, and then absolute horror as she processed what she was seeing. "General Whitmore," I announced, my voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect, "I believe we have some business to discuss." Marcus dropped the phone he'd been holding, his mouth falling open as he stared at the 4 stars glittering on my uniform. Victoria simply stood frozen, her face pale as understanding dawned. "That's impossible," she whispered. "You're just a captain. You've been a captain for years." "I was a captain yesterday," I replied, stepping fully into the room. "Today, I'm a brigadier general, with direct authority over every defense contract your little operation has been sabotaging." The third person in the room, another lawyer I didn't recognize, began frantically gathering papers, clearly eager to distance himself from what was rapidly becoming a federal crime scene. "General Whitmore," he stammered, "I think there's been some misunderstanding. Your client was systematically defrauding the United States government while poisoning a military veteran," I interrupted. "There's no misunderstanding about any of that." Victoria finally found her voice, though it shook with barely contained panic. "This is some kind of trick. Rebecca, you can't just show up in costume and pretend to be someone you're not." I reached into my jacket and withdrew the official promotion orders, signed by the Secretary of Defense himself. "These aren't costumes, Victoria. They're the culmination of 15 years of distinguished military service." I placed the documents on Dad's desk, directly in front of where she stood. "Brigadier General Rebecca Marie Whitmore, United States Army Corps of Engineers. Effective immediately, I have direct oversight of all contracts between the Pentagon and Whitmore Defense Solutions." The implications hit her like a physical blow. Not only had she failed to steal Dad's estate, but she'd committed federal crimes under the direct supervision of someone who now had the authority to ensure she faced the full consequences of her actions. "This changes nothing," she said, but her voice lacked any conviction. "The business contracts, the estate issues, those are separate matters." "Actually, they're not," I replied, opening another folder I'd brought with me. "The FBI investigation into your activities has uncovered evidence linking the estate fraud directly to the contract irregularities. You weren't just stealing from my father, you were stealing from the American taxpayers." Marcus finally spoke up, his voice cracking with stress. "Victoria, we need to leave. Now. This whole situation is going nowhere," I finished. "Federal agents are currently positioned at every exit from this property. You're not leaving until this matter is resolved." Victoria's facade finally cracked completely. "You self-righteous little bitch," she snarled, all pretense of civility abandoned. "You think your precious uniform makes you better than everyone else? You think you can just waltz in here and destroy everything I've worked for?" "I think my uniform represents something you'll never understand," I replied calmly. "Honor, duty, and the willingness to sacrifice personal gain for something greater than yourself." I gestured around the library, taking in the scattered papers and overturned furniture that marked her desperate search for leverage. "Dad built this company to serve his country. You tried to turn it into your personal piggy bank. That ends today." The sound of vehicles pulling up outside signaled the arrival of the federal agents I'd mentioned. Victoria rushed to the window, her face draining of color as she saw the FBI tactical unit taking positions around the estate. "General Whitmore," came a voice from the doorway. Special Agent Sarah Chen entered the library, her badge clearly visible on her tactical vest. "We're ready to execute the arrest warrants." Victoria turned back to face me, her expression a mixture of rage and disbelief. "James loved me," she said, as if repeating the words could make them true. "He would never have wanted this." "Dad loved the idea of you," I corrected. "He loved the woman he thought you were, not the predator you actually are." The difference is that he saw through your act before it was too late. Agent Chen stepped forward with handcuffs. Victoria Kowalski, also known as Victoria Caldwell, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, illegal procurement of controlled substances, and suspicion of homicide. You have the right to remain silent. As the Miranda rights were read, Victoria's eyes never left mine. Even as the handcuffs clicked into place, she maintained eye contact, as if trying to will me into acknowledging some shared understanding of what had transpired. But there was no shared understanding. There was only the truth, that she had preyed upon a good man's loneliness and paid the ultimate price for her greed. Marcus was arrested next, his involvement in the business fraud making him equally culpable. The lawyer had already disappeared, apparently deciding that his association with Victoria wasn't worth the potential career consequences. After the arrests, Agent Chen and I stood in the doorway of the library, surveying the damage Victoria had inflicted on Dad's sanctuary. Your father would be proud, Chen said quietly. The case he built was meticulous. He knew exactly what she was doing and made sure we'd have everything we needed to put her away. I nodded, feeling the weight of Dad's final gift settling on my shoulders. He hadn't just protected his estate. He'd protected me, prepared me, and trusted me to finish what he'd started. Over the following weeks, the full scope of Victoria's crimes became clear. She faced federal charges that would likely result in life imprisonment, while Marcus and several other accomplices received significant sentences for their roles in the conspiracy. The company's reputation was restored through my direct intervention with Pentagon leadership, and several new contracts were awarded based on our renewed commitment to excellence. But perhaps most importantly, Dad's faith in me had been vindicated. He'd seen potential in the young woman who'd chosen military service over immediate involvement in the family business. He'd understood that the discipline, integrity, and leadership skills I'd developed in the Army would ultimately make me a better guardian of his legacy than someone who'd simply inherited responsibility without earning it. 6 months later, I stood in the same library where Victoria had celebrated her anticipated victory. The room had been restored to its original warmth, with Dad's portrait returned to its place of honor above the fireplace. The business was thriving under new leadership, the estate had been settled according to Dad's wishes, and justice had been served. Victoria had walked into this room thinking she'd won everything. Instead, she'd discovered that some battles can't be won through manipulation and deception. Sometimes, the person who walks through the door wearing 4 stars has earned the right to be there and has the power to ensure that justice prevails. The lesson was simple: never underestimate the woman who chose duty over comfort, service over safety, and honor over personal gain. Because when the moment comes to defend what matters most, she'll be ready for anything. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.